Welcome, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Uh, so I want to welcome everyone to our talk today with the brilliant and wonderful Kaya Oakes. I'll introduce myself first and then I'll introduce Kaya. I'm Sundari Johansen. Many of you know me already. I'm an assistant professor in the Women's Spirituality PhD program and the Women, Gender, Spirituality, and Social Justice MA program in the Department of Philosophy and Religion here at CIIS. And I am honored to introduce our guest today. Kaya Oakes is a journalist and author of several books, most recently Not So Sorry, Abusers, False Apologies, and the Limits of Forgiveness, which was published by Broadleaf Books in 2024. Previously, she authored The Defiant Middle, How Women Claim Life's In-Betweens to Remake the World, The Nuns Are All Right, that's Nones, The Nuns Are All Right, and Radical Reinvention. And you can also find her on her Substack, and I'll provide the link for that in the chat. She teaches writing at UC Berkeley, and her work has received multiple awards with her essays and journalism appearing in The Guardian, Slate, Foreign Policy, The Washington Post, and On Being. She was born and raised in Oakland, California, where she still lives. Welcome, Kaya. And I will say I'm going to invite Kaya to talk about her book for a bit, and then we'll have a conversation, and then we'll open it up to a couple of questions, whatever we have time for at the end. So make note of your questions, and when we have time for that, we will open it up to those.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johansen, and everybody for being here. I know this is a difficult time of the semester for us. We are in the 7th week of a 18-week semester. I can't remember how long it is, but it's a tough time of the semester, so I appreciate you taking the time out to be here. I'm going to if you could give me screen sharing privilege, that'd be great, and then I can get my slides up. Before I do that, though, yeah, so I have some questions that I'll include just for self-reflection and conversation, but you can, of course, always add them in the chat as we're going along, and happy to answer those. So let me see. Okay. Yeah, I still don't have a screen share access though.
Should. Hi, this is V behind the scenes.
Maybe.
Should. That's what's showing on my end. Let me invite you to there you
You
are.
get that?
Mhm.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank
Okay,
you.
here we go. Who are we without slides? Um, so as Sundari said, my name is Kaya Oakes. I'm a senior lecturer in the college writing programs at UC Berkeley, where I've been since the 1999. And I am a journalist, essayist, and I write about religion, gender, and particular the intersections of American Christianities and politics and gender. So this book came about as the result of a lot of conversations that were going on between myself, my editors, and readers to a certain degree in the wake of Me Too, so around 2018, and then during the COVID pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement. One of the things that I was reporting on in my journalism work was the idea of apologies and how do institutions and individuals apologize. And so this led to the kind of central inquiry, which is of the book, which is why are the apologies that are often issued in the wake of a traumatic event really bad apologies? And what is a good apology versus the ones that we see? And then what does that mean when we see a lot of kind of shallow or false apologies? What does that do to our understandings of forgiveness culturally, particularly here in the USA? as a result of some of the articles I was writing, an editor contacted me and said, "Do you want to turn this into a book proposal?" And I said, "Sure." And as is the case with trade nonfiction books, the kinds of books that I write are very similar in terms of the length of researching to a dissertation, except that you don't get a degree at the end. So bummer, because I'd have 6 PhDs now, which would make my head very big probably. But as a result of the amount of time that it took, a lot of stuff changed, right? You pitch a book in 2018, 2019, and if it doesn't come out until 2024, the world is a very different place. But one thing that seemed to be consistent throughout the time that I was researching and writing this book is that we still don't have a very good conversation about what it means to be forgiving, to offer forgiveness, to ask for forgiveness. And as a result of that, forgiveness can be kind of abused. And I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. So this is just a quote from the introduction. I'm going to move this window over here. For better or worse, the notion that failing to grant forgiveness is spiritually damning has led to centuries of people being forced to turn forgiveness publicly and privately into a performance. So that's sort of one of the central things that I think I wanted to unpack in this book was, what do we, if we are condemning people for not being forgiving, then is that in itself a form of abuse? So my background in scholarship and journalism, like I said, isn't particularly on American Christianities and American history. And then my individual background is in American Catholicism, and I've written and reported a lot on the Vatican and the sex abuse scandals. And I actually was just, I was just asked to write an obituary for the Pope just in case he dies. So, which is kind of when my life is like kind of very strange assignments come my way. But the publisher is American, and so I really wanted to look at the inextricable links between American Christianity and how Americans think about forgiveness. However, I'm aware that your program is focused on multiple spiritualities and multiple religious traditions. I'd love to hear more about your own research into Eastern religions, Islam, Judaism, indigenous spiritual practice, and how forgiveness manifests in those traditions too, because as with most scholarly and trade nonfiction research, my research was pretty narrow. So I'd love to hear more about what you have to say on this topic. So when we look at American history, we have to unfortunately, it's very tied in with Christian history and particularly with colonialism, manifest destiny, etc. But a lot of that comes from this idea that most of us understand or are taught as children that forgiveness is kind of a moral gift that we're granted, even if we don't deserve it. And so that's something that has fueled our collective imagination about what forgiveness is and isn't. We often think in the second quote here that forgiveness is a virtue and failing to forgive is vice, sin, or failure. So then it becomes a performative kind of repentance and forgiveness where a person asks for forgiveness, but then they keep on doing whatever kind of behavior that led to the request in the first place. So philosophy, religion, art, and literature, forgiveness is often depicted as liberating for the person who's done something wrong. Modern psychology has begun to focus instead on the idea that being forgiving is really about liberating the person offering the forgiveness. Problem there is that we start to see forgiveness as transactional, right? Like, if you forgive me, I forgive you. You owe me something, this and that. And so we have a kind of warped understanding of forgiveness as a result of this transactional relationship. So the psychologist Jean Safer, whose book I found very helpful, it's called Forgiving and Not Forgiven. She says that enshrining universal forgiveness as a panacea a requirement or the only moral choice is rigid, simplistic, and even pernicious. So she's very anti the idea that everybody needs to be forgiven everything, which is how a lot of American Christians teach this. For marginalized groups, however, an unwillingness to be forgiving can be useful for actually creating social change or protecting the community. And one of the examples I talk about in the early chapters of the book is the AIDS epidemic and how millions of people were abandoned by their parents and families. But it was the unforgiving pressure from organizations like ACT UP, which were led by gay men who at that time were the most at risk of contracting AIDS, that actually pushed the American government into funding medical research. They were not willing to be forgiving, and as a result, we got the drugs that can now make it possible for people to live with AIDS. And it's so that was a movement of unforgiveness. But forgiveness is very tied up with power. Culturally powerful people demonize and refuse to forgive the culturally weak, all while demanding that the weak forgive the powerful without preconditions. If any of you are also here in the California, we have the homeless crisis, for example, the idea that homeless people are to blame for their homelessness and that they should be forgiving of, for example, where I live in Oakland, an encampment being swept away, and that they're expected to just say that that's okay, right? And so that's sort of, again, leads to a power struggle, turning forgiveness into a power struggle. So when I was starting to research this, I wanted to figure out where did we go wrong in our understandings of forgiveness. And I talked to a number of biblical scholars, and what they all said is that the word for forgiveness in the Bible does not mean forgive and forget. It's ephemene, if any of you know Koine Greek, which I studied for one semester in college a million years ago, so I needed help with this. But it means putting distance between yourself and the person who's done your harm. And Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg, who is a friend of mine and a rabbi and a scholar, and she's a wonderful book called On Repentance and Repair, which I cited quite a lot. And she talks about two different words for forgiveness, mechila and slicha, which I apologize for my pronunciation. But she says these ideas about forgiveness that we get from the Hebrew Bible are more about relinquishing a claim and looking at the harm doer with compassion, but only after they've done the work of repentance, which is a step I think we skip a lot of the time. So she says that none of this implies that the harm never happened. Jewish repentance literature points to the question of what do we need to do to close accounts? So the forgiveness has more steps involved in that tradition. In South Africa, during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that happened after the end of apartheid. Sorry about that. I lost my slides for a minute there. The commission that was looking into, get my slides back up here, looking into the abuses and trying to bring about some accountability for those, talked about the concept of Ubuntu. The late Bishop Desmond Tutu, who you're probably familiar with, defines this idea of the idea that my humanity is caught up in yours. We say a person is a person through other people, and a person with Ubuntu is open and available to others, affirming to others, etc. So the idea is less in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa and in the restorative justice movement, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, is less about forgive and forget and more about what does the common good need and what is forgiveness when we're thinking about more than just individuals, when we're thinking about a collective of people and how we are tied to one another in our humanity. Because I grew up here in California, I was very interested also in this question of what does it mean when people like Native Americans are asked to forgive institutions like the Catholic Church or the University of California when it comes to histories of abuse. Of course, we have all followed the stories, most likely have followed the stories of what we're learning about what happened at the residential schools that were run by Catholic religious orders, where children were taken from their parents. Their language was taken away, and they often died at these residential schools. It's a very tragic story. But I was interested to delve more into the story of Ishi, who was a Native American man found wandering around in the Sierras by Kroeber, who was an anthropologist who taught at UC Berkeley. And Kroeber took Ishi. Ishi's family had been massacred, and Kroeber brought him to the Bay Area. And at that time, the anthropology department at UC Berkeley was actually in San Francisco, where your school is located. And Ishi was made into a living exhibit. So he was made to carve arrowheads and show people how he hunted on Mount Parnassus, actually. But he died from tuberculosis because people who would come to the museum to look at this living human being spread tuberculosis to him, and he passed away. And so Native American activist and writer named Dina Gilo Whitaker, in an article in Native Country, she wrote about Ishi and the idea of when groups of people like Native Americans are asked to forgive things like genocide or missionaries or forced conversions, that what we should talk about instead is healing historical wounds, because what you end up is having people being held to an impossible standard when they're asked to forgive these kinds of atrocities. But it still happens. The Pope traveled to Canada just 3 or 4 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, and gave a big song and dance about being forgiven for the residential schools. And some of Native Canadian activists said no thanks to that. So I mentioned that I report on the Catholic Church a lot, and the sex abuse scandal, of course, is an example again of an institution committing atrocities and then being asked to be forgiven for those. Um, a religious institution that commits acts of abuse is central to understanding how forgiveness can be manipulated. Sex abuse in particular is exacerbated in churches and in other places like Hollywood, and I would say even like Silicon Valley, from what we're learning about some of the climate at some of these tech companies. Sex abuse can be exacerbated by hierarchical culture. So oftentimes what would happen in the Catholic Church and then in evangelical churches too, is that when a pastor or leader was accused of abusing people, found to be abusing people, they would be moved around. And so sort of like, rather than being demoted, because it's a hierarchical culture, so rather than being demoted, they would be kept in their clerical position, but they would be moved around so that they were protected. And again, the abuse victims were often asked to forgive their abusers. So if you've seen the movie Spotlight or know anything about the bankruptcies that are going on in the Catholic Church in America, the church has paid out millions and even billions of dollars, but it's often asked for forgiveness from victims, but failed to say anything about accountability or specific plans to prevent further abuse, which goes back to what I was talking about from the Rabbi Ruttenberg, and the idea how in Jewish understandings of forgiveness, there's always that step of repentance and atonement. And so a lot of the time, institutions don't like to be specific about that, because they can then, pretend that they changed when they didn't actually change. We're in a moment right now where white evangelical Christians are very much colluding with the government to enact some of the executive orders that we're seeing, or influencing some of the political climate right now. And part of the problem with abuse in evangelical churches is that there's no central reporting body where cases can be referred. So pastors are often the most powerful people, and there's nobody above them, right? And so again, the problem for evangelicals who experience abuse is that there's a real pressure to forgive in evangelical circles, but there's nobody mediating the accusations of abuse and between that and the pastors and the victims. So in other words, pastors often get away with it. So Catherine Joyce, who's one of my fellow religion journalists and a really excellent writer who's written a lot about evangelical Christians and hard right political swing in American evangelicalism. She says that part of the problem is that there's a heavy emphasis in obedience in evangelicals, and as a result, they're trying to protect the institution meant that abuse cases were hidden, but they do argue that forgiveness is required for salvation. And so Reverend Carol Howard Merritt, who's a Presbyterian minister, but she grew up in Southern Baptist Church, which is evangelical. She says that many evangelicals turn forgiveness into a form of spiritual abuse. So, like, if you're not forgiving, God will, but God will not save you, and you're condemned to hell. And so that enables this kind of cycle of abuse to continue. Her book, by the way, Reverend Carol Howard, sorry, here I go, I'm in circles now. Part of the problem is that I keep going forwards and backwards because I can't see the bottom of my screen, so I apologize for that. Part of the Carol's book is called Healing Spiritual Wounds. If you're interested in that, then I highly recommend it. So let me go back to my first slide, just a second here. Sorry for the technical difficulties, but we're kind of used to this now, given where we are. Okay. Sorry about that. Hey, at least this isn't happening in class. Yesterday I had my slides crash in the middle of class, so that was not fun. Okay. So abortion and forgiveness. So of course, given the fact that we have seen the end of legal abortion in America, what has happened as a result of that is again this idea about purity that has led to a lot of abuse of women and women's bodies. So the obsessions with virginity and what we call purity culture meant that many people who sought out abortions were made to feel like they needed to ask for forgiveness as a result from their church, right? So that it was a shame. They were shamed, they were told they were condemned, and they needed to ask for forgiveness. And then when abortion happens as a result of sexual assault, however, people are still ashamed for seeking it out, which creates this shame cycle. And the irony that a woman who's had an abortion in many churches will feel like she needs to go and ask for forgiveness to continue to be part of the church community, whereas the man, of course, who impregnates her does not have to do that. So that kind of fermented and bubbled into the backlash against abortion that, led to the end of Roe versus Wade. The quote I have up here is from a writer named B.D. McClay and her essay on Maria Goretti, which is, I'm not going to go into the whole story, but in the book, I talk about the fact that Maria Goretti was 11 years old when a man attempted to rape her, and the Catholic Church they made her into a saint because she died what they call in defensum castratus, which means protecting her chastity. And so there's this long tradition that girls and women who died trying to avoid being raped are considered to be holy and saints. And part of the reason that they're elevated to sainthood is because they forgave the men who tried to rape them, which I find completely just absurd and bizarre. Anyway, I do recommend reading Barbara's essay. It's called Problems Like Maria, and it's in the magazine Commonweal. And then self-help and pop psychology are part of our problems with understanding forgiveness as well, because pop psychology, or what we refer to in internet speak as therapy speak, leaves a lot into the idea that we need to forgive ourselves, and that if we are more forgiving of ourselves, we can go forward in life with a clean conscience, and that it's helpful for depression and anxiety. Now, in many cases, this is true. Many people who struggle with things like low self-esteem or depression do feel, that when they forgive themselves, that it is helpful. However, when we are talking about abuse, or violence or other behaviors like that, the problem is that sometimes abusers will forgive themselves for being abusive, and as a result, they go and continue that abusive behavior. So the danger again here is the slippery slope between forgiveness is good and everyone should forgive everyone everything, and what happens when people forgive themselves for truly egregious behavior that is harmful and continue to be abusive. So two stories that I use in the book that we can talk about further if you want to, or or you could just feel free to read up on this on the internet. Mother Teresa, whose care homes were known in India and other parts around the world for being places she was, known as being this merciful saint and so compassionate, so caring, and she experienced what people call spiritual darkness, where for a long time she didn't feel like she was hearing the voice of God. And as a result of that, it was sort of an excuse for the deterioration of the care that was offered in these care homes. So I'm sure that those of you who have heard the stories about the conditions in these homes that sick people go to are often they're very dirty. The medicine is, administered to them in very painful ways. And she forgave herself for that. She felt that it was off of her conscience. And there's many journals that she wrote where she talks about, that she was just so deep into the spiritual darkness that she didn't know what was going on. I feel like that's probably not true. I highly recommend a podcast called The Turning, which is about and it's based on a book that was written by a woman who was a member of the Missionaries of Charity, who worked with Mother Teresa, who saw some of these things happening. And the podcast goes into how that was allowed to run rampant. Another example is L'Arche, which is a series, it's houses that are all over the globe for adults with developmental disabilities. And these homes were started by a man named Jean Vanier. And Vanier, again, while he was providing this wonderful, compassionate care to these adults with developmental disabilities, he was also abusing a lot of the women who worked in the homes. And he, again, wrote and talked about how he didn't feel like it was a bad thing to do, how it was, God forgave him for doing it. And so again, the abuse was allowed to continue for a long time. And again, there's a great podcast that's put up by Sojourners magazine about the scandal, but all this came out after he died. So unfortunately, the wounds, were not allowed to heal while he was living, and there was no accountability. And much the same is true with Mother Teresa. A lot of the stuff that's come out about her, the issues in the care homes, was not really brought to light until after she passed away, which is a whole other problem. But again, this idea of like when we forgive ourselves for something, that's good, if it's something that's not hurting other people in this kind of systemic, calculated way, right? But people maybe should not forgive themselves when they're being abusive or colluding in things that are hurting and sometimes killing other people. So I end the book talking about restorative justice, which is something that I've always been interested in learning more about. This graphic, I think, is a good explanation, sorry, of how restorative justice works. And much of restorative justice is based on indigenous and native practices, but in America, the model for restorative justice that is used in a lot of communities here comes from Howard Zehr, Z-E-H-R, who is a Mennonite. Mennonites are they are peace churches, so like the Quakers, they are they don't serve in the military. They are really interested in reconciliation, community reconciliation. So Zehr is somebody who has written a lot of books on restorative justice and sort of provides this model that this graphic represents. And so the idea is that it's not just about victims and offenders, but the community has to be included too, right? So the relationship is not just victims and offenders saying, I forgive you, I don't forgive you. It's about what does the community need to recover? What are the root causes of the crime in the first place? What are the things we can do to reintegrate people into the community in a culturally sensitive, collaborative way? So it's less of a one-on-one. And I talked before about how a lot of time our relationship to forgiveness is very transactional. And in restorative justice, it's less transactional and more about a process. So one of the examples I use in the book is actually takes place here in Oakland, where I live, and at an elementary school in East Oakland, which is it's a neighborhood that has a lot of crime and not a lot of resources. They have tried restorative justice principles at elementary schools. So, for example, if kids are fighting, instead of putting them one-on-one together and saying, you have to forgive this child for, taking your lunch or whacking you in the back of the head and all the things that kids do, instead of it being a one-on-one, the whole classroom is included. So, and the teachers included and the principals included. And it becomes, again, like, why, rather than just you owe this person forgiveness, but why did this happen? What are you going through? What are we as a community experiencing that led to this aggression? And like, how can we solve this problem together? It's been super successful at elementary schools in Oakland. So the kids have actually gone out into, and I think this is so cool, the kids who are like, I don't know, K through 8, right? So they're like 5 to 12 years old, will go out into like community centers, senior centers, churches, mosques in the community and teach how to do restorative justice, which I think is amazing. Of course, the budget cuts, this program is probably not long for existing, given the debt that Oakland Schools is dealing with. But that being said, it's a really good model for thinking about forgiveness as being more of a collective process. So again, to quote from Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg, trying to put forgiveness ahead of healing has the potential to create more confusion and to prolong a process that requires time and tears, perhaps additional support, and certainly an honest grappling. So part of where I end the book is on this idea that we need to think of forgiveness as a process and not a product. And also that maybe we just need a better definition of forgiveness rather than this constant notion of us owing each other something, and thinking more about how can we heal our communities through processes like restorative justice. Okay, so just want to end with this quote from Safer again, because I think this sums up a lot of what I think is useful for us to kind of like maybe get into conversation about, which is, she says, the doctrine of universal forgiveness is one size fits all absolutism, encouraging people to strive for this unrealistic goal, even when the motive is salvaging their psyches or saving their souls, instills feelings of inadequacy in anyone who fails to achieve it. Worse, it encourages false forgiveness, which threatens to inundate our public as well as our private lives. The question, does this person deserve to be forgiven, and am I able to do it, should not be taboo. To insist in forgiveness in all cases is to confuse forgiving with resolving, to equate unforgiveness with vengefulness, and to ignore the critical role subjectivity plays in determining what is forgivable and what is not. So I think that's really helpful. I think psychologists have a really interesting lens into this notion that we should always be forgiving of everything, because they know that that's just not possible, and it's not a one size fits all process. So these are just questions I thought of that might be useful. I'm sure we can talk about whatever, but how do you personally define forgiveness? Has your understanding of forgiveness changed or evolved over time? How do we talk about forgiveness in our political moment, which we were talking about just at the beginning of this Zoom call? Have you ever struggled to forgive someone or something and found you couldn't do it? What happened as a result? And is forced or coerced forgiveness real forgiveness? So I will, what I'll do is when I get out of slides, I'll copy those questions and put them in the chat, and then we can either come back to them or not. But I like to give people some takeaway questions to think about. And then just finally, we're going to get into conversation, but I have some further reading suggestions, which again, I'll copy and put into the chat before we wrap up, including Rabbi Rettenberg, Howard Zehr, who I mentioned, Michelle Alexander, of course, from Oakland, California, the new Jim Crow and mass incarceration. Chanel Miller, who was the very courageous woman who came forward with the Stanford rape incident, and her book is a really, really fascinating lens into how an abuse victim talks about that experience. Jean Safer, Elizabeth Flock's new book, which is called The Furies, on Women, Vengeance, and Justice. Carol Howard Merritt, Soraya Chirali's book on women's anger and rage. I mean, it's Women's History Month, so obviously, like, some of these are not just about forgiveness and justice, but just about the experiences of women within those topics as well. So again, I'll copy and paste those and put them in the chat. And then and we're going to talk for a little bit, but if you want to reach out to me, I have quit all social media. Hooray! And I feel great. It's like my brain just got scrubbed clean, and I just asked my students, like, instead, like, what are people talking about on social media? So I hear what Gen Z is talking about on social media, which is fascinating. I do have a Substack, and it's on gender, religion, culture, and I am living with breast cancer and continuing to go through treatment for that. So I've been writing a lot about that, and, like, whether we should forgive doctors who misdiagnose things, or like insurance companies. That's an interesting question given what happened with Luigi Mangione. But my email addresses are here, and again, I'll put them in the chat. Academic questions, go to my Berkeley email, and then anything, if you ever want to talk about writing for a broader public or anything like that. BC, before cancer, before COVID, I did often give workshops to scholars on how to write for a broader public. That has kind of slowed down a lot, but I'm always happy to talk about how do you do that, because it's something that I've helped people do for years and years, and occasionally help grad students with at Cal too. But that being said, I'm going to stop sharing, and while we move into conversation, let me go down and copy and paste that stuff out of my slides. But Yeah, thank you all for being here again.
Thank you so much, Kaya, for that presentation. Um, I really I really loved your book. I
Thank you.
was an early reader of it, and very honored to be so. Um, I have a few thoughts that I just, like to talk about, and I want to leave, plenty of time for conversation with the folks that are here as well. Um, one of the big things that um, that has been going on, just certainly discussions online, which congratulations for getting off of social media. That is an act of resistance in and of itself. Um, but one of the big things, when we're talking about what's going on right now in the US, not just in the US, I mean, there's a big authoritarian swing going on around the world right now, but and that has been going on for the last decade and a half. But in terms of what's going on right now in the US, um, aside from this idea that we now have just with the political appointments, the president, the political appointments, this idea that there is no need for forgiveness. Powerful people do not need forgiveness. They have the power to set reality. I'm thinking of M. Gessen and their book Surviving Autocracy, where they talk about the bully lie. That the bully lie is like the bully who steals your hat and then is wearing it and then denies having done so. And then you have to kind of decide if you're an onlooker, you kind of have to decide which reality are you going to choose. Are you going to choose the reality of the bully or the reality of the victim, right? Um, and so there's this whole other paradigm emerging with, this dynamic of power. Um, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, but also packing another just another question
Yeah.
here. The thing that I'm really thinking about is this conversation going on online as people are sort of um, reacting to and responding to and sort of waking up from the paralysis of the sort of onslaught of the last, more than 30 days now, month and a half of the Trump administration and the sort of sledgehammer to public institutions and all the rest. This idea of and also basic fundamental human rights of trans people, of immigrants, of people of color, of women, and a sort of active attempt to erase uh, certain populations from public life. Um, I'm wondering about this idea that people are arguing about what to do with the Trump voter who's sort of in the find out phase, right? um, who's sort of starting to feel some regret and wants sympathy and wants wants forgiveness, right? In a sense, wants community and is feeling really pressed and feeling regretful. But there's a lot of people saying, no, we shouldn't forgive them. We shouldn't let them and we shouldn't trust them. Um, Sort of what do you think about that dynamic and um, what are some things that we might think about when looking at that?
Yeah, I was actually just thinking about this today because I'm teaching a class for undergrads on gender and writing, and we're going to read the executive order together and talk about. So we're reading a book by Alan Johnson, who's a sociologist, on the origins of patriarchy and how a lot of that's related to control. And so we're going to read the executive order and gender. And the question I had, and these are 18-year-olds, right? So like the frontal cortex is still being formed, but they're super smart because of course they go to Berkeley. So I want them to unpack this idea of how the executive order is coming out of this idea that you can control people's gender identity from the outside in, right? And so So people who experience regret for voting for Trump, this is, I think, where we get back to this question of like, do we forgive the institution or do we forgive the individual, right? So a lot of time when people vote, for example, for someone like myself, who's kind of a democratic socialist, I guess, I don't, I don't know what I am politically, but I guess I would lean in that way, that I vote based on what I think my community needs first, and then what I need second, right? But a lot of the time, conservatives vote on what they need first and what their communities need second. And again, that's the result of these structures that make us feel that our individual selves trump and our individual needs trump that of our community. I'm sorry, I shouldn't use the word trump there, are more important than that of our communities. So the forgiveness is like, are they asking to be forgiven for the way that they voted? But is the way that they voted because what did that happen because they're selfish, or did it happen because they were pressured through this idea of scarcity mentality that makes us feel like nobody has enough of anything, and so you have to put yourself and your family first ahead of everybody else. So it gets complicated for that reason. But yeah, I mean, personally, like, I don't know. I can't think of a single person I know who voted for Trump. So it would be really hard for me to know how I would handle this personally. But I did watch a little video, I think it was on the BBC the other night, from a veteran who voted for Trump 3 times, was recently laid off. As a result of these job cuts, which we're very worried about at Berkeley because a lot of our funding comes from the NIH for medical research, and then that funds like labs on campus. Anyway, that's a whole nother thing. But the vet was like, and the newscaster kept pushing him and saying, "Do you regret your vote? Do you feel sorry?" Right. So she was kind of pushing him to experience, and he had no remorse whatsoever, even though he had lost his job. So I think a lot of the time people just don't understand that votes affect a lot of different people. So like if they feel like they made a mistake in voting, it tends to be this conversation about how does this impact you individually rather than all of us, right? And I think maybe that's what people are waking up from. But I see somebody put in the chat, what's the name of Gessen's book again?
I don't think it was Gessen's book. I think it was a book on the origins of patriarchy. Was that the book that was being asked about?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. It's called The Gender Knot. Here, I'm putting it in the chat. The Gender KNOT by Alan Johnson. It's a little bit old, but I think it still holds up. And the nice thing is that it's out of copyright, so you don't have to pay for it. If you're assigning it to your class, your students can read it for free.
So yeah, so thanks for that. And I think that keeping this dual lens on individuals, institutions, and some of what you're saying is, about sort of like different mindsets sets of different people who hold different sort of political beliefs. Reminds me of some of George Lakoff's work with values and how we hold values and how to talk to people of different political backgrounds. George Lakoff also, of course, being famously at UC Berkeley. How has looking at your Substack, and sort of a lot of what you're writing about is about cancer and your experience with it. And I enjoyed reading your incredibly fiery recent post about menopause and hormonal treatments and aging. But one of the things that I'm curious about is how your experience of breast cancer has informed or impacted your thoughts around things like community and restorative justice and I know you've spoken before about sort of learning in real time about the importance of community. So could you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's been an interesting, I mean, I don't wish this on anybody, but I will say that one thing about cancer and getting it at a relatively young age is that it's very clarifying because you sort of very quickly learn who you can rely on, who you can't rely on. You learn very quickly about navigating the shit show that is the American health insurance world. I do have to say I had excellent care at Kaiser Oakland, which was shocking because of the reputation. But one thing my surgical oncologist said right away is like, who are your people? And I think that has been something that I've learned a lot about. I did there is in the cancer world we talk about cancer ghosting, which is when friends and family and acquaintances and coworkers cannot handle you because you are kind of a walking reminder of death, right? And so especially when you're going through, I'm wearing my appliance today, but I lost a lot of teeth, for example. So the chemo deteriorated my gums, and I have no front teeth. And so, for example, when people see that, they are a little shocked, a little surprised, right? And so, again, so some people, like my students, I wear a mask in class, for example, but when I'm giving a talk like this, I'll put the appliance in. And then you'll wear, a wig to cover the bald head. Barbara Ehrenreich, the late, great Barbara Ehrenreich, wrote the best essay I've ever read about cancer for Harper's Magazine. I'll put a link in the chat at some point. But one of the things she talks about is how cancer makes you very angry. And one of the things that people are least forgiving of from women is when we get angry, right? Because it is not normative for us to experience anger, but getting cancer is, it's very unfair. It's not 1 in 8 people with breasts will get it. That is unacceptable that many people get it in America, and that there's clusters here and there. So I knew all along through treatment, I sort of like could see I didn't see a light at the end of the tunnel. I saw, the idea that, thank you for the link there, that Welcome to Cancerland is the name of her essay. One of my heroes as a writer, by the way, because she was a labor activist and then became a journalist, which I think is a really unique set of experiences. But I could see through the treatment that what was at the end of the tunnel was, thank you for that note. Two things. One is, I'm going to get through this with the help of other people, but some people are not going to be able to handle this. And some people leave your life during cancer. And I'm trying to reconcile with a friend right now who kind of dropped out. A friend of hers died from cancer. So when I got diagnosed, she couldn't handle it because she didn't want to see me die. And she said that. She said, I can't watch you get sick. I can't. So she's very afraid to see me without the teeth because she's afraid she'll laugh. And I'm like, that's fine. But we're trying to, forgive each other right now. And I do consider her a part of my community, and she's an important person in my life. And I do understand why she reacted the way she did. But I also knew from diagnosis to I'm still in treatment, but to where I am today, that I was going to understand my cancer experience as a social justice experience, because I felt that the intersections of gender, age, race, social class, this is just where I live. And as a person who thinks a lot about faith and belief, the idea of that we don't survive disease as individuals, we survive it collectively. So yeah, that's kind of a messy answer to your question, but thank you, Anjali, for yes, solidarity. It's all too common of an experience. I discovered after treatment that when I went back to, was off work for a year and I went back, and 3 people I work with in a department of like 20 something people had breast cancer. And so, yeah, so that too creates a kind of solidarity. So it is, and I've had to work on like understanding myself differently too, like being sort of like not the same person I used to be. It's not just the teeth and the hair and the eyebrows and the boobs, all that stuff. It's like your spirituality changes, you become more sensitive to other people and more empathetic, I think, but I'm also angrier. So it's a weird mix. But yeah, so in answer to your question, I think that we should talk more about illness and disease as issues that impact our understandings of forgiveness too, because your body betrays you. Your body's trying to kill you. So how do you live with a body that is trying to do you in? And that's a question I don't know the answer to yet.
Yeah, someone who I live with multiple disabilities, and one of the things that the disability community often talks about is that it's okay to not like your body or to be angry at your body, that sometimes body positivity can be really toxic when you're disabled, and that it's okay to be, to be angry at it sometimes, um, to and to forgive yourself for there's a way that forgiving yourself can be really positive, right? For being angry at your body, in a world where we're told we have to accept our bodies no matter what, right? It's a very ableist position.
Mhm.
I want to open it up to our attendees. Do for folks to, if you have a comment, if you have a question for Kaya, we have about a half hour to have an open discussion. So I want to open it up. Katie. Is it Katie?
It's Kathy.
Kathy.
I just wrote a message on the chat. I gotta meet with a student at 4. But it was a pleasure to hear you speaking, Kaya. I've been absorbing so much of your information through podcasts mostly, and yeah, it feels really good. I left some information about me on the chat. I work at UCSC, and sometimes I have to tell students that they need to forgive or write apology letters so they don't get part of conduct processes. So, whew.
Yeah, it's a big, what you do is really important. And I think that I don't even know if we have that at Berkeley. Like, I don't know if we have a restorative justice center. I know that it's a conversation that they have like in social welfare and other individual departments, but that's great that Santa Cruz has that. I'm really glad to hear that.
Actually, Berkeley's Restorative Justice Center is more developed than anything at UCSC. I actually trained there.
Oh,
And
nice.
the work I do is through a student conduct. So when the students get in trouble, which means now they're getting in trouble just because they're protesting and whatnot, right?
Oh, yeah.
Then we
Yeah.
have these interventions that are different and more human, and still we're in the institution and budgets and whatnot, as you all know. But it's a pleasure to be here and see familiar faces. Hi, Ellen. And I'm an alumni of Women's Spirituality from the master's program, and super good to see everybody. Hi and goodbye and thank you.
Thank you. That's
Thank you,
great.
Kathy.
Bye.
I just wanted to thank you, Kaya, for sharing about forgiveness. I was very intrigued by the description in of your book, and I'm going to read it. And as a fellow survivor, I completely concur with so many of the experiences that you shared. And as for me, it was really a clarifying moment. And I don't wish it on anyone, like you said, but it really oriented myself into understanding the political, like the intersections between politics, healthcare, social justice. And I'm 11 years survivor. I got it at 37. Changed my life, changed everything. The world changed. So I wish you well, and in your journey, I don't think I want to call it journey. I want to say wilderness, because wilderness. My question to you about the forgiveness aspect of the work that you shared is, I really looked at Mia Mingus's framework for accountability and apology. She comes from a transformative justice framework. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on that, because I use that a lot in my work. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Tell me more about it, because this is a field that I'm still learning about.
So she talks about like a 4-step. She's written a long thing on accountability and how to ask for apology, especially in like a systemic way, or even like, in a movement based work, like justice movement based work. And she talks about, if there is some harm done, then how do you go about keeping that person accountable in a loving way. And first is I think there are 4 steps. There is self-reflection, there is action, like saying what you're going to do to make repair and build trust, and it's like a 4-step process. So that's the kind of framework that I'm kind of like used to. So I was wondering whether you know something about that, and how is that different or similar to what you are offering?
It sounds pretty similar to what Zaire talks about and what the rabbi I mentioned talks about. So in the restorative justice chapter, and I don't have a copy of, see, I'm a terrible author, like I don't have a copy of my book right here, but there's a 6-step process. So you're talking about 4-step process, but
Yeah.
there's a 6-step process that they use in restorative justice that sounds very familiar. It's like reflect, accountability, and then bring the community into it. And so I can't remember what all the steps, but it sounds very similar. And so I know that, for example, there's an activist slash writer here in Oakland named Sandia Jha. She's actually in grad school now, but she does worked at the Oakland Peace and Justice Center for a long time doing community-based activism. And I think that that again is the steps process. So one of the things that Danya, Rabbi Rettenberg, talks about in her book is that oftentimes the most important step that's skipped over is accountability, right? And so that the person or institution never actually recognizes what they did wrong. And as a result of that, when we leap over that step, the person or institution is less likely to actually commit to change as a result. So I think that sounds like there's a lot of overlap there. And also that just from doing the research for the book, and then previous to that, when I was interviewing and talking to of survivors of clergy sexual abuse, again, what they talked about a lot of the time was, again, the problem that led them to not being able to be forgiven, which they shouldn't be in the first place, in my opinion. Like, I don't think you should necessarily be forgiving of that, but that they often felt that when there was accountability, it was always very broad and kind of non-specific. Like, we will strive to do better. We will put victims first, but never very specifically talking about what that looks like. And I was recently on a podcast, and the journalist asked me, have you ever read a good apology? And I couldn't think of one. And I think that's very telling of where we are with our failure to write and offer one another apologies that include those specific steps of accountability, which again enables abuse to keep going, because if there's no accountability, then the person just runs rampant. I will see if I can remember what the 6 steps are. Just Google, I'm sure would be able to tell you. But if you would put the name of that book in the chat for me, I would appreciate that, because I have not read it. So thank you.
Great. And is it Sa? Is that correct?
Yeah, thank you. I love this talk. Thank you so much, Kaya. It's Kaya, right?
It's Kaya, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for being here. I'm really interested in your scholarship and following up with you at a later time. I'm actually in the Philosophy, Cosmology, Consciousness program as a master's student. I have a few questions, but really I think I just might only focus on this one and then see if there's any time at the end for a follow-up. But I'm particularly wondering about this conversation we're having about institutions. This actually connects to our political administration right now, as well as though just educational institutions, corporate, elite kind of conglomerations of power, and how these kinds of environments, I think based on, patriarchal confluences and colonialism and things like that, sort of lend this very troubling atmosphere that enables abusers to be forgiven. And I'm particularly thinking about narcissists. I think it's like pretty safe to characterize the political administration being culpable in that, and the kind of the psychological complex around that. Some things related like, victim mentality, sort of like, oh no, it was never me, it's always somebody else. But how these institutions can absolve them from their harms, like even if the person has, some evidence or something, but the insidious nature of the abuse can be often overlooked or excused. And also that connects to what you were talking about with femme people, but I think also just marginalized people in general being sort of this awful disadvantage against the tide, precisely because our emotions are so weaponized against us, and that in instances of where people in power who are abusive are abusing someone who's marginalized, there's this whole phenomenon about reactive abuse and how, like, we might express anger or like act out of character or something because we're being abused, but then that's weaponized against us and it's like, oh look, you're the problem, and it can sort of absolve the abuser from their responsibility. I was just wondering, what scholarship might come to mind for you, or if you could speak more about kind of these dynamics of the narcissist victim complex, or any of that comes to mind.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. I do think that I'm not a psychologist, so like caveat, I from what I understand about narcissism, a lot of the time the reason that narcissists engage in abusive behavior or feel that they don't owe anybody forgiveness when they're abusive is because there's a lot of intersections between narcissism and sociopathy. So it's that inability to understand the emotions of other people. And so it kind of goes back to like that, what in psychology, the dark triad, right? Which is narcissism, sociopathy, and Machiavellianism. So as a result of those three things kind of overlapping in a lot of ways, it's that, again, that inability to understand that you've even done something wrong. So again, because I'm not a psychologist, I can't really analyze like why a narcissist does what they do. But from the research I did for the book, there is often a pattern of people who are abusive being narcissists, right? And so, of course, like we could all kind of diagnose the current president very easily as a narcissist too, because we do see that same pattern of like, like self-obsession, grandiosity, this lack of empathy, this lack of understanding of the consequences of actions, et cetera, et cetera. But I think part of why narcissists often prey on or tend to punch down on marginalized groups or marginalized individuals is because they see them as weak. They see them as, Musk recently referred to like people on welfare as the parasite class, right? For example. So again, they see them as being less deserving of things than the narcissists themselves, right? So a couple sources, let's see, I put in the chat this list of books that I found helpful, and a couple of them have to do with some of what you're talking about in terms of these relationships between particularly like femme women or not sometimes non-binary people and institutions. I think Elizabeth Flock's book, which is called The Furies, it's very much a book that's written for it's not a scholarly book, but she is a great reporter, and she spent time with communities of people who do like street justice and kind of like fight back against abuse. So there's the Indian group that I forgot the name. I apologize. I'm hitting that part of the day where my brain starts to fritz out, but it's in India. They're called Gulabi Gang and something gang. You know who I'm talking about, Sundari and Anjali, you're nodding. And so she writes about them. She writes about women and revenge, like women who have like actually, revenged themselves against their abusers, whether that's not always physically, but often just like vengeance, the idea of like vengeance and like getting even with abusers. And I want to put in a plug too for a book that's coming out in April that I wrote a blurb for by a friend of mine. It's called No One Taught Me How to Be a Man by Shannon Kearns, and he's a trans man, and it's about his experiences growing up in evangelical culture and his struggle to forgive his family for rejecting him when he came out as trans. And it's a really wonderful book that kind of examines kind of some of these questions of like, what does it mean when our gender identity is not acknowledged or recognized? And I think there is some discussion from what I remember when I was reading it to write the cover blurb that there's some conversation in there about narcissism too. And then I was also going to recommend Soraya Chirali's work, Rage Becomes Her, and then her more recent book is on the myth of resilience. It's called The Resilience Myth, and how we as a culture kind of like fetish, especially post-COVID, like we kind of fetishize this idea that we're all resilient and strong. And I think those of us who've been through cancer, for example, know that you cannot always be resilient. Sometimes you are actually exhausted and beaten down, and that's okay, right? That's what makes us human. And she's also a really great writer. So yeah, that's just a couple off the top of my head. But it's an interesting question and a really interesting um, field of inquiry that I hope you get to pursue in your MA, because it sounds like a really appealing path to follow.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Ellen?
First of all, thank you very much, Kaya, for your book, for bringing this to the world, because I think it's in need. And when I opened my email, I was like, oh my God, that's all that I need to listen it. I am Brazilian, so I came from a very Catholic Christian background. And in Brazil, we don't talk about not forgiving. We just talk about forgiving. And for the most part of my life was a blur between what is to forgive and what is to live with the person. And I was living with abusers and trying to forgive and was confused in the middle of everything. Or I went to many therapists and they say, oh, it's just forgiving. It's just about forgive. And I went like family constellation, and they were like, forgive that for, and was so. And I at that time I didn't know it was a kind of re-traumatizing my experience. So I'm very glad that I'm reading it, and it's very helpful for me. I have been thinking on about this thing for a long time now. I work with women. I am an alumni from Women's Spirituality, and I have been thinking about this because many women are taught to forgive cheating, betrayal, and in order to keep their relationship, and it's a kind of violence, and nobody talks about this. So Thank you very much for
Yeah.
bringing this to the world.
Absolutely. Thank you too for being here. I do think that it is true that when it comes to things like infidelity, the onus to forgive, the responsibility is often put on the partner who was cheated on, right, has to be forgiving. And then the problem is that creates an imbalance of power in the relationship that can lead to further infidelity or, abuse or whatever. But I also know that it is possible to have reconciliation, but the problem is that the person who is the done the harm has to again acknowledge what they did, right? And oftentimes that's really difficult, especially since you're from Brazil. I think culturally, there's a lot of machismo, and I'm from an Irish Catholic family, also very patriarchal, very machismo. My father was, the authority in the house, even though there were four daughters. Like it was definitely, he was the last answer to everything. And as a result of growing up in that environment, one thing I've been talking with my students a lot is like, I have to unpack my own patriarchal ideas, right? That I have to be, I have to be available to everyone. I have to be helpful to everyone. I have to be forgiving to everyone because I was taught in my religion, in my culture that I come from too, that like women always forgive because it's for the sake of the family, for the sake of the home, the children, etc. And what you end up is with this generations and generations of miserable women who are like stuck and they could not get divorced in Catholic families because they just didn't get divorced, at least in our family. And so as a result of that, you get this what they call epigenetic trauma. So like the trauma is passed down, the trauma of having to constantly forgive an abusive or cheating spouse. It actually there I talked about this in my last book on women and archetypes and like how we do and don't live up to them. Epigenetic research is showing that this may impact our health, right? Like, so if your grandmother was abused and she, her health suffered as a result, the genes were changed, and then your mother inherited those damaged genes, and then you inherited those damaged genes. Now, I'm not quite RFK enough to think that that's why I got cancer. That's not why I got cancer, because I just had bad luck, right? But I do think there's something to this idea that we inherit these culture when we come from cultures where women are supposed to be forgiving, that we inherit some of that. We have to constantly for the rest of our lives kind of be deprogramming ourselves from that kind of reflexive, like, it's fine, I forgive you, it's okay. I don't know how many times a day I say to people, it's fine, like even just like if you step in line in front of me at the grocery store, I'm the first one to say, no worries, it's fine, it's okay, right? When I should be like, I was next, right? So I think that is cultural in a lot of ways, and that again, like it takes a long time to unpack it, but it's important that we do. So thank you for that.
This sort of brings to mind of how do we get to a point where, if we have a culture that is really aggressively centered around this idea of the have and the have-nots, that you either have or you don't, and there are winners and losers, right? It's sort of like where our sort of hyper individualistic culture has been drifting or been dragged towards, right? How do we shift the culture to a place of shared responsibility, of mutual beneficial, like acknowledging that situations can be mutually beneficial, that if we're all doing well, then we're all doing well, right? That there doesn't have to be winners and losers.
Yeah.
That scarcity is not a myth, it's, because there is definitely real scarcity and definitely people suffering, right? And people who hoard resources, and then, there's not enough for everyone else. But also that it doesn't have to be that way, right?
Right. I've been teaching Audre Lorde for a few years now, and I think that she's such an important corrective for a lot of my students who worked their asses off in high school to get into Berkeley and are just going to this existential crisis of like, I'm so lonely, I have no friends. I'm so alone at this huge school where I'm in competition with everybody. And having them read Lord and introducing them to the idea of a horizontal movement versus a vertical one, where like we can all work together and share resources instead of hoarding them. For a lot of these, I hate to call them kids, young adults, it's their first time ever hearing about something like that because they're Americans and they grew up in this capitalistic competitive society. And so they don't, the idea of a shared responsibility, or that Ubuntu concept that Tutu talks about, is completely new to them. Like they had no idea. And the papers they write about it are a little clumsy, but what they're trying to do is like reconcile that is a possibility with the actual what they're seeing in the world with this hyper capitalistic, competitive, individualistic thing. So I do think that just giving students, since a lot of us here are academics or people who work with students or are students yourselves, like giving yourselves the opportunity to ask these kind of messy, uncomfortable questions in the work and process that and know that we're not going to solve anything overnight, but that the more that we can kind of give ourselves permission to kind of say, what would that look like? Like, so that's one thing one of my students was like, I get what Lord's saying, but I don't understand what it would look like to have a world where we all shared resources. I'm like, exactly. So this is where you use your imagination, right? You use your visions. You free yourself up to say, okay, I'm an engineer, what can I do? I'm a doctor, what can I do? I'm a lawyer, I'm a elementary school teacher, whatever. So yeah, that's just kind of where I've been at with these, where we are right now. Just helping people to kind of give themselves permission to say, what does that actually look like?
Yeah. Do we have any final questions from our audience? All right. And Kaya, do you have anything any question you want to pose or any final thoughts you want to share? Any plugs you want to make?
No, I just really appreciate you all being here at this stressful time in the world and academically and individually. And it says a lot when, to me as a writer, like I've written a few books now, and if even like two people read it, I feel like it was worth, all the years that went into it. And so getting asked to do talks like this means a lot. So yeah, definitely appreciate you all being here and asking me to come.
Yeah, and I think that speaking for myself, but it sounds like speaking also for others in the room, I'm really glad that you're doing the work you're doing in the world, and I'm glad that your students have you to open up their minds to some new ways of thinking about things.
Thank you. They probably don't feel that way right now because
I'll appreciate it in 10 years.
We'll see how it goes tomorrow. But I appreciate that. Thank you. And thank you all for being here again.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I think we can stop the recording now.